Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is joining us today. My name is Lola Garcia-Lix. I'm the Senior Advisor on Global Governance at the International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs, and I've been honored by the organizers to help with the moderation of this event. But I would like to, on behalf of the three organizers, the International Indigenous Women's Forum, FIMI, the International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs, IWGIA, and the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, I would like very much to welcome you to this event, which will focus on how to advance Indigenous women's knowledge and rights in combating the climate crisis. This side event is organized as a contribution from Indigenous women to the upcoming session of the Commission on the Status of Women, which will start on Monday, and which has as a priority theme achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. But before we go into the topic, and even before we go into the roundtables, we will start having a spiritual opening by Lorena Lopez, who is a Maya Quiche woman from Guatemala. And after Lorena, we will have some opening remarks from Tarsila Rivera Sea, which is the Executive Director of CHIRAPAC, President of FIMI, and former member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. But Lorena, the screen is yours for the spiritual opening remarks, please.
Muchas gracias. Que el corazón del cielo y el corazón de la tierra las reciba, las acoja, escuche a cada una con lo que trae hoy en este amanecer, en este mediodía, en esta tarde, que la energía de la Madre Tierra, que la savia de esta planta, las reciba y que cada paso que cada una ha dado se colme de alegría, de ternura, de sabiduría. Vamos a iniciar invocando, abriendo nuestras manos. Cada una abre sus manos, abre su energía y su luz y vamos a invocar a nuestras energías. Ponemos nuestra mano en el ombligo, saludando al centro de nuestro ser, al punto de equilibrio y a la fuente de la vida. Saludamos y nos inclinamos ante la vida. Desde que venimos del vientre de nuestra madre y ponemos nuestras manos en el ombligo, agradeciendo ese hilo de vida, esa unión de un óvulo y un esperma que nos permitieron llegar. Agradecemos el tiempo de engendramiento, el tiempo de nacimiento, nuestra niñez, nuestra juventud, nuestra edad adulta. Agradecemos nuestro hoy y abrimos nuestras manos. Y le decimos a la sagrada agua, al corazón del agua donde nace el agua, que limpie, que lleve y que trascienda toda tristeza, toda preocupación de nuestro territorio cuerpo, pero del territorio de la Madre Tierra, de la Madre Naturaleza, de la sagrada agua, del sagrado viento, de los animales y las semillas. Hoy que es el Nahual Quemé, en nuestro calendario, en el calendario maya, saludamos a la energía de todos nuestras y nuestros ancestros. Nuestra ancestra y ancestro semilla, nuestra ancestra y ancestro agua, nuestra ancestra y ancestro maíz, nuestra ancestro y ancestra bosque, a todas las especies de animales, a todas las abuelas, abuelos, adultos y adultas que trascendieron y que regresaron a la fuente de la madre tierra, al vientre. Y a los que hoy regresan al vientre de la madre tierra e inician su conexión con el cosmos y retornan al cosmos, retornando a la madre tierra, retornan al cosmos. Gracias una vez, gracias 2 veces, 3 y 4 veces. A todas nuestras ancestras, animales, plantas, minerales, agua, mujeres y hombres que se nos han adelantado, que van caminando delante de nosotras y nosotros. Que hoy son agua, que hoy son fuego, que hoy soy un viento, que son aves y son una estrella en el firmamento. Hoy le decimos particularmente a todas esas semillas, a todas esas plantas, a todos los mares y los ríos que han sido contaminados por ese sistema de muerte. Y hoy le decimos a las abuelas y abuelos que trascendieron, cuidando, amando y defendiendo la vida, infinitamente gracias, porque nos dejaron el legado a los pueblos originarios y a las mujeres de amar y defender la vida, de cuidar nuestro primer territorio energético, físico, emocional, mental, que es este primer territorio. Pero también nos dejaron el legado abuelas y abuelos de la cabeza blanca, del oriente, del poniente, del norte y el sur, para seguir defendiendo la vida de los ríos, de los mares, de los bosques y de las montañas, para seguir cuidando y defendiendo las semillas. Infinitamente gracias. Pedimos hoy a la energía de todos esos seres de luz, de las energías del Nahualquemé, que acompañe la vida y le dé fuerza a las defensoras de la tierra, del agua, de los bienes comunes naturales. Y a todas y todos los pueblos y territorios del mundo y de este planeta, que aún y a pesar de este sistema, siguen amando y cuidando la vida. Siguen saludando a la sagrada agua, al sagrado viento, a los sagrados planetas, a la sagrada tierra, recordando que solo somos un hilo en esa red de la vida. Hoy, abuelas y abuelos de la cabeza blanca, semillas, plantas, agua, mares, les decimos que ponemos frente de ustedes, delante de ustedes, detrás de ustedes y de su lado, este encuentro, este caminar de las mujeres que caminan en la defensa y el cuidado de la madre tierra y de la madre naturaleza, aún y a pesar de este sistema, y que están enfrentando, pero sobre todo caminando para construir caminos, estrategias, propuestas frente al cambio climático, frente a la voz de la tierra y del agua que dice, basta, ya no me lastimen, basta, yo tengo alma, tengo energía. Y hoy ofrecemos esta luz, esta energía, para todas las hermanas que están en el planeta, en el oriente, en el poniente, en el norte y en el sur, pidiendo que la sagrada agua lleve su tristeza, lleve su cansancio, lleve su dolor y lo trascienda y lo transforme en fuerza, en alegría, en vida. Pidiéndole al sagrado fuego que nos siga dando la fuerza para no callar, para levantar la voz, para seguir caminando junto, cerca y al ritmo de la madre tierra, de los animales y del agua, del viento, de los planetas, de nuestras hermanas las estrellas. Y hoy decimos Gracias una vez, 2 veces, 3 y 4 veces. La sagrada agua las cubra. Abrimos nuestras manos. A todas les enviamos este agua sagrada. Y les invitamos a seguir cuidando la vida, cuidando su vida. Abrimos nuestras manos, todas por favor, nuestras manos abiertas, para soltar todo aquello de este sistema y de este tiempo que nos hace estar tristes, cansadas, frustradas tal vez. Y decimos, levantamos nuestras manos y nuestras alas. Y como mujeres de pueblos originarios y de distintos pueblos de este planeta, seguimos caminando, seguimos soltando, abriendo las manos para unirnos y trabajar juntas. Todas las mujeres del planeta en el oriente, en el poniente, en el norte y en el sur. Todas las niñas, todas las adultas, todas las abuelas y todas las que están naciendo, que van a hacerle el caminar y la continuidad de la cultura de la vida. Que esa energía de los abuelos que se adelantaron y las abuelas, semillas, personas, minerales, nos guíe, nos oriente y nos dé fuerza para continuar. No en la lucha, en la resiliencia, en la propuesta y en el derecho a una vida con dignidad, conviviendo con la madre tierra y la naturaleza. Muchas gracias. Una vez, 2 veces, 3 y 4 veces. Nos abrazamos cada una y este abrazo es el abrazo del viento, el abrazo del agua, el abrazo de los planetas y nos cubrimos del polvo de estrellas. Lo recibimos y nos dejamos caer el polvo de estrellas. Y nos abrazamos con la energía de quienes se adelantaron, con la energía de quienes hoy tenemos cerca y con la energía de quienes vienen atrás. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Lorena. Gracias por iluminarnos. Gracias por transmitirnos todas estas energías para poder desarrollar este evento a todas nosotras, a todas las compañeras, a todos los participantes. Con tus palabras, con tus sabias palabras, quería dar la palabra a Tarsila Rivera, CEA. Yo creo que Tarsila no necesita demasiada introducción, es la directora ejecutiva de Chirapac, la presidenta del FIMI, es una activista quechua de Ayacucho, que ha trabajado por más de 20, 30 años defendiendo el reconocimiento de los pueblos indígenas, el reconocimiento de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, de sus culturas, el derecho de las mujeres indígenas. Creo que todas sus contribuciones como miembro del Foro Permanente sobre las cuestiones indígenas en Naciones Unidas, todo su trabajo en las redes de mujeres indígenas a nivel continental, pero a nivel internacional también. Entonces, para mí es un gran honor contar con Tarsila para unas palabras de apertura de este evento. Y por favor, Tarsila, tienes la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias, Lola. Muchísimas gracias, hermanas Vicky, hermanas que nos escuchan de las diferentes regiones del mundo. Como FIMI, aquí las impulsoras nos sentimos orgullosas de haber llegado a los 20 años caminando nosotras mismas, pero también recogiendo los pasos y los logros que hicieron nuestras mayores, nuestras ancestras. Hoy nos encontramos para mirar hacia atrás, hacer un balance y proyectar acciones conjuntas para los siguientes desafíos. desafíos que necesitan hablarse como mujeres indígenas con voz propia para que en el escenario internacional, bajando a lo nacional y a lo local, se concrete lo que tanto anhelamos, el respeto y el reconocimiento de nuestros derechos como pueblos, como culturas, como mujeres, como niñas y jóvenes indígenas. Hablamos en este contexto de crisis climática, pero también nos ubicamos en los escenarios donde se discuten temas relacionados a nosotros, a nosotras, como la próxima sesión que viene de la Comisión de Estatus de la Mujer 66, que justamente incorpora temas íntimamente ligados con nuestros conocimientos y también con nuestros aportes, que deben ser recogidos y reconocidos en esas recomendaciones. Las mujeres indígenas, me parece que en los últimos 40 años hemos incidido desde el espacio del movimiento mixto, pero también en los escenarios donde como mujeres indígenas hemos tenido que luchar en los dos frentes. En el frente de nuestros pueblos, en el plano interno, pero también en el escenario internacional y como mujeres indígenas en el escenario donde se discutían y se discuten los derechos de las mujeres. Tenemos grandes avances, grandes logros, y creo que la estrategia apropiada de haber empezado las recomendaciones desde el foro permanente a través de las diversas representaciones que hemos tenido han dado su resultado. Hoy las mujeres indígenas estamos en las agendas del sistema de las Naciones Unidas. Necesitamos tener mayor presencia y participación activa en las conferencias que tienen que ver con cambio climático y también en los escenarios donde nuestra especificidad como mujeres indígenas sean reconocidos en nuestras capacidades a la solución de los problemas. Hace poco comentaba con la hermana Vicky qué tan vigentes están las recomendaciones que ella hizo en su periodo de relatora especial de Derecho de Pueblos Indígenas. Y cuando uno ve el escenario del respeto a los derechos de la madre naturaleza, tratar de erradicar las causas del cambio climático, erradicar las violencias que se dan en todo sentido y de manera multidimensional, vemos que hay esfuerzos, hay avances, pero ¿dónde está el problema? Porque cada día respiramos noticias de violencias, de guerras y más bien de depredación de los recursos que nos da la madre tierra. Cada día estamos hablando y buscando soluciones al impacto de las industrias extractivas porque terminan con el agua dulce, terminan con la vida de la tierra y la madre naturaleza. El impacto que muchas veces nosotros no lo entendemos desde nuestro espacio local. Solamente sabemos que hay cambios y que hay cambios que ya no son causas naturales, sino que son el impacto de repente de ambiciones desmedidas para el crecimiento económico. Entonces, más que nunca, queridas hermanas, jóvenes, mayores, mujeres prominentes, tenemos que seguir enfrentando el gran desafío de defender nuestras vidas y de seguir luchando por el reconocimiento y respeto de esos derechos, pero como somos parte de la madre naturaleza, de la Pachamama, en todos los rincones del mundo, hermanas de los océanos, de tierras áridas, de desiertos, de islas, de altas montañas, de bosques y de las llanuras, tenemos que mirar a un solo sentido, lograr derechos plenos para todas y para nuestros pueblos. Por eso el desafío que nosotras recibimos también de nuestras ancestras y nuestros mayores sigue siendo un desafío que la nueva generación tiene que continuar. Y por eso es tan importante, hoy que hablamos de crisis climática, ¿qué legado dejaremos para las futuras generaciones? Y las mujeres indígenas nos encontramos tratando también de lograr una recomendación general para mujeres indígenas en la CEDAW, en el Comité CEDAW. ¿Por qué? Porque tenemos que hacer visible y hacer entender que la indivisibilidad de los derechos colectivos y los derechos individuales desde las niñas, jóvenes, mujeres y pueblos indígenas debe estar incluido también en esos instrumentos que tratan la erradicación de la violencia y para nosotras las violencias que son multidimensionales, históricas y además medio asolapado con una ideología racista por ser diferentes, por ser de culturas específicas. Entonces, el lograr la recomendación general de CEDAW y lograr el reconocimiento de nuestros aportes como para la solución de los problemas del impacto del cambio climático que salga de la CSW, articulado con CEDAW, nos ha de dar otro escenario favorable. Pero ahí está el gran desafío. ¿Qué tanto nuestros gobernantes se comprometen a hacerlo realidad, implementando y respondiendo a sus compromisos asumidos en el plano internacional? Con esto, queridas hermanas, FIMI, el mecanismo que responde a los intereses de todas las mujeres indígenas en el mundo y con sus aliadas y aliados construidos a través de los últimos 40 años, nos sentimos felices de empezar este webinar con ustedes. Muchas gracias y que aprendamos mucho y nos escuchemos mucho.
Muchas gracias, Tarsila. Thank you very much, Tarsila. Thank you very much for raising the issue of the challenges, but also what it has been achieved, the great achievements, and what is in the way forward in many ways that we have to build it together. The last issue, and I will take the issue of the challenge on how to develop these good recommendations, great developments into real action at a country level, real action from the governments, real action from those who committed to implement it. It's very important, and I hope this side event also will help us. I mean, will help us. You mentioned the Commission on the Status of Women, which is the principal intergovernmental body of the UN, exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women. The session of the Commission on the Status of Women, the 66th session, will start on Monday. And as Tarsila also mentioned, is one of the essential processes. Because, why? Because they implement, or they are mandated to implement programs to advance the political participation and advocacy to ensure gender equality and empowerment. And you cannot do that without Indigenous women, girls. In addition, the priority theme this year will be achieving gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. And it is in this context, in the context of these discussions, that Indigenous women voices should be heard, their demands taken into consideration, and their recommendation valued and incorporated in decision taken at the session. Therefore, this event intends to provide a space that brings together Indigenous women leaders from the different regions, Africa, Americas, Asia, Pacific, and the Arctic. And we are very honored to have also with us the former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Ms. Victoria Towley Corpus, also an Indigenous activist and an Indigenous women's activist. We hope that the speakers during the event will highlight the good practices and lessons learned to achieve gender equality and empowerment of Indigenous women and girls, including those with disabilities, in the context of climate change, environmental, and disaster risks reduction. Indigenous women are agents of change. And if the world wants to address the climate crisis, they won't be able to do it without Indigenous women. So, with these words, I would like to start the round panel discussion. And I will start introducing Molly Bella Akello from Uganda. Molly Bella Akello is a professional humanitarian aid worker, and currently she works as the executive director of Fountain of Life, Uganda. It will be posted in the chat. It will be posted a longer bio for Molly. But in order to save some time, I will only introduce the speakers with a shorter bio information, but all information will be put in the chat. Molly, in your experience and coming from a country that has had challenges of climate change, inequalities, women's discrimination, and lately COVID-19, how have Indigenous women and girls managed this situation? Can you share with us some of your experiences? Molly, the floor is yours. Molly, are you there? I don't think Molly is there.
I saw her name, but it's mute.
Okay.
Let's see if
Molly, can you hear us? Can you? I cannot see her.
Oh,
I think she fall down from
maybe she. Yeah. Maybe you can get the next one.
Yeah, I think we should wait for Molly but we will continue. So from Africa, we will go to the Arctic, and we are very pleased also to have with us today at Joanna Absalonsen. And Joanna has an MA in cross-cultural studies from the University of Copenhagen, and she's currently working as an employment consultant in the Youth Center in Copenhagen, Denmark, but she has Greenlandic roots. And I know she has been working a lot on issues of Indigenous women or gender issues in the Arctic. So we are very pleased that you were able to join us today, Joanna. And in your experience, Joanna, with the perspective from the Arctic region, how have Indigenous women addressed practices that promote gender equality and their empowerment in the response to climate change crisis? Please, Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lola, and thank you all very much for having me today. I'm going to talk about Indigenous women in the Arctic, and I'm going to focus on the Indigenous rights movement and the different organizations, and about Indigenous women's role in the climate crisis. And the indigenous rights movement is in many ways a result of women's emancipatory movements in the 60s, after UN's efforts of decolonizing after World War II to change in governance structures in the Arctic countries. Yeah, and the indigenous movements is the Allied International Association, the Arctic Athabascan Council, the Gwich'in Council International, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, and the Sami Council. I'm going to focus on the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which is the organization that I've been working with the most. And the Indigenous women's movement in the Arctic is formed by these diverse organizations. And colonization's role has often resulted in a collective historical trauma and disempowerment, and the Arctic indigenous peoples share a common holistic ontology, but have varying views on gender and empowerment based on their traditional cultures and also from interaction with the dominant Western cultures. And what is interesting is inherent in the Inuit language. Gender is absent and no distinction between he or she. That's a perspective in the gender roles in the Inuit Nunat, the Inuit countries and the Inuit people. Relevant when discussing gender equality in the Arctic is gendered outmigration and mobility, the so-called brain drain problem, where especially young women are moving thousands of kilometers to pursue higher education and employment, and many don't return. Women moving away from small Arctic communities is challenging the sustainable development. And as climate change brings with it challenging environmental, social, and economic changes, diversity and access and participation in policy development is critical. As we all know, the Greenlandic ice sheet is melting, thus the sea levels rise, the albedo effect sets in, and it influences feedback mechanisms. And many technical observations in research could further include a methodology of more perspectives of the living conditions and indigenous knowledge in the most affected communities in the Arctic. And the Inuit Circumpolar Council, ICC, advocates for Inuit-led environmental monitoring and management of Inuit Nunat and increased mobility between Canada and Greenland, which should improve the self-sufficiency of Inuit across Inuit Nunat, building on the UN declaration. That's a part of ICC's, the UGIA declaration from 2018. Last year, the Arctic Council's Sustainable Development Group published the report Gender Equality in the Arctic, part 3, where researchers describe how indigenous women's rights, both in the Arctic and globally, have often been neglected at the international and local level, and how a human rights-based approach might help to ensure women's participation and legal status in the international climate regime. Gender remains marginal in the overall body of scholarship on climate change adaptation. And in general, research is emphasizing men's knowledge and thereby misses information embedded in women's activities. Women make their own observations during their travels, their activities on the land and on the water. Through the indigenous women's work, we see preparing seal skins, sewing, picking berries, collecting seaweed and eggs, processing fish, etc. Women's observations are also vital to portraying and grasping the secondary effects of climate change that occur in the Arctic communities. And this includes the social consequences of environmental change. Among others, they include the availability of country products and a related sense of food security and identity. The report is also concluding the need for a gender-sensitive and intersectional approach, where gender equality is considered a prerequisite and accelerator of progress towards sustainable development, seen both in the Arctic and globally. I think it's important to mention the work of Indigenous knowledge being practiced by Indigenous women in the local communities that we maybe don't see that often, don't hear that much of in the regular media. But in online communities, a lot of Indigenous women are sharing practices from the land. It can be socially and spiritually, but also economically, since it is also reported that Arctic Indigenous women in many communities are the primary wage holders. Women are both hunting, doing domestic tasks in everyday life in the family, working in learning environments, doing language protection, children's work, community work, but also appear as leaders and scientists. And I have a few examples from Greenland of young people, young Inuit organizing Fridays for Future. An example from Nuuk, where they are sharing and participating in climate activism. We have a PhD and postdoc in microbiology and a researcher in Inuit traditional foods, Evia Lubert-Hauptmann, and she recently launched a new biology education program at Ilisimatusarfik, University of Greenland, and it is called the Sila Biology Bachelor Program. Instead of conventional biology program, it is a program based on specific strengths of Greenland and the Greenlandic people. It is a program tailored to the strengths and desires of Greenlandic youth with a decolonization action behind it. And many of you may know Dukumingwak Nykia Olsen, who is from Inuit Circumpolar Council. She's an office and project manager there. And she's often sharing a lot of Indigenous knowledge practices on hunting and Indigenous food on her online platform. And she's also contributing with profound knowledge from the UNPFII, the Permanent Forum, and the Arctic Indigenous Fund. And I see a lot of different young people, and especially Indigenous women, sharing a lot of knowledge and activity with each other on social media, especially Instagram, and that I see as a somehow an empowerment way of lifting each other up and sharing knowledge in another way than reports and academic texts and so on and so forth. And I think that is an important aspect of being a young Indigenous woman today. And interesting, and I will encourage you to research more on these matters, because it's very interesting for all of us. And I think it's important to address the challenges and ways forward for Indigenous women's movement in terms of achieving gender equality at every level. It is women supporting women and other genders in these online communities such as Instagram, as I just talked about. And it is also sharing Indigenous knowledge on other platforms, on the land, hunting, picking berries, fishing, exploring the land. It is creative and cultural heritage. It's oral traditions, art, beading, knitting. It is spiritual and artistic practice and research throughout the Inuit Nunat. For example, Inuit tattoos. It is a practice shared throughout the Arctic and the Inuit, and they're sharing methods and history, and they're exploring what has happened to a lot of the cultural heritage from the past several hundred years. And I think it's important to call upon more acknowledgement and curiosity about Indigenous concepts in the gender discussion. And researchers also call for more diverse data on Indigenous women's perspectives in the Arctic and their everyday lives and social and environmental practices in the response to the climate crisis, and also the sustainable development in general.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's about it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you very much for your very important presentation to taking us through many of the issues regarding gender and Indigenous women in the Arctic. I think the whole issue of Indigenous knowledge, the crucial role that Indigenous women play in the issue of preserving, promoting, ensuring the Indigenous knowledge. It's crucial, and the role in that sense that they play in their communities, but also the importance of Indigenous women sharing with each other practices. I think it's an important point that I take from your presentation. Also, of course, about the challenges. You mentioned the issue of the gender remaining being marginal in a situation that Indigenous women play such a crucial role, and the need to apply a human rights-based approach. And of course, you end by encouraging researchers, I suppose Indigenous researchers also, and the need of data, the need to document and prove with data the crucial role that Indigenous women play. So thank you very much, Joanna. And from the Arctic, I will try again if Molly is with us, or if not, I will go to the next speaker. Is Molly there? Okay. So if Molly is not there, I will go to...
Yes, Molly is here, Lola.
Molly is there. Okay. Molly?
Yes, I'm here. Yes,
okay.
yes, please.
Okay.
I'm
okay,
here.
Molly, I will introduce you again a little bit, mainly just that Molly is a professional humanitarian aid worker, and currently she works as the executive director of Fountain of Life in Uganda. And I will repeat the question, Molly, that I said before when I couldn't reach you, that I would very much like to hear about your experience coming from a country that had great challenges with regard to climate change, face Indigenous women, face great inequalities, discrimination, marginalization, and of course, also in the context of the last COVID-19 pandemic. And how have Indigenous women and girls managed this situation? Could you share with us some of your experience? And please keep the time 10 minutes, because if not, we won't have so much time for the next speakers, but we would very much like to hear more about your experience. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And sorry about the network, which it was a little bit unstable, but I think it is stable right now, and we can share experiences from Uganda. I would like to request the moderator to share the screen with us, the presentation.
Your presentation is on, Molly.
I'm not seeing the work.
It's there, the presentation is there.
Let me share.
No, it's the presentation is there, Molly. We can all see your presentation.
Yes.
She was mute, she is mute. You have to unmute yourself, Molly.
Okay. Molly, can you see your presentation?
Yes, I'm back, sorry. So this is, yes, I'm seeing. So this is the question that I'm privileged this evening to share with you in our own experiences, having come from this kind of community. Next slide. Next slide, please. Please share the slides. Please share the slides.
It's being shared.
I think, Molly, you can continue your presentation if you can without the slides because something is wrong. There is some problems with regard to the presentation of the slides. Molly, you are frozen again.
She fell down from the call one more time.
Okay, I think we should continue and see if we can, while the next speaker, because we cannot wait more. So I will give now the floor to now Min from Myanmar. And Min is the director of Point, Promotion of Indigenous and Nature Together from Myanmar. And she's an executive council member of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. She has been advocating for sustainable environmental and economic policies from all Myanmar people, regardless of gender or ethnicity. She has also been awarded the U.S. Embassy Women of Change. And the very pleased to have you here with us today. And I know the difficult situation that you are going through in Myanmar at this moment. But we would very much like if you could share with us today some of the Indigenous women good practices for biodiversity, conservation, and climate change in Myanmar. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I want to do screen share on my own and let me know everyone can see the screen share now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, let me. First, I would like to talk about our indigenous people in Asia context. Today, I prepare my presentation more on the Asia context as a broader one, and also to reflect more of AIPP work. Although my work is more focused on my country, now I want to share about indigenous people in Asia. And indigenous people in Asia and in the world, we conserve about 80% of world biodiversity, and we represent most of the world cultural diversity. And the homes of indigenous people is overlap with the most biodiversity rich area of the planet. That's why indigenous people are very much important for biodiversity conservation and as well as climate change action. There is enormous biocultural diversity among indigenous people in Asia, you may realize, and we have strong culture and we have spiritual attachment to our land, and we depend our traditional livelihood, almost everything on the land, forest, river, sea, and the natural resources we have from this natural environment. And for indigenous women, we indigenous women, while there is around of 260 million indigenous people living in Asia, indigenous women make up 50% of this population. This shows that we are equally important in taking care of the natural environment and biodiversity as other indigenous men in our region. Indigenous women, we are the key practitioner. We are innovator, and we are holder of indigenous knowledge in relation to our livelihood. We are taking care of preserving indigenous seed, maintaining food security, and sharing the well-being of our community member, because we are a woman, also the mother, also the grandmother, also the sister to our community member. And our role is taking care for their food security, at the same time taking care everything that provide the food, everything about the biodiversity that we have from the forest and the natural environment to provide food for our family. And we are also taking care of the role as the one who transfer our indigenous knowledge and cultural value and our seed and food system in the community. That's the reason why we are very much important in terms of biodiversity conservation at the community level. And I want to give an example of Akar indigenous people. Akar indigenous people, we have it in Myanmar, also in Thailand. And one of the prominent cases of Akar indigenous people is the understanding of the 9 level of agriculture system. Means that for Akar people, women are symbolized as diversity and fertility. And we try to be proud about the Akar people. They trying to the way they trying to look at a hardworking woman is when the guests go in visit to their house, they look at the kitchen. If the kitchen has a lot of variety of seed preserved and taking care, it shows that this woman is a hardworking woman. It's not like the people in the city comparing how much a woman has income. It's a different world. And for Akar indigenous people, and their understanding of 9 level of agriculture is that the different type of trees in the agricultural system, starting from perennial, seasonal fruit tree grown at different height, higher level, lower level. They look at the different layer and the level and say that there is 9 level of agriculture, showing the variety of seeds and biodiversity they preserve in their agricultural system. And we can, if you are interested in, there is a documentary film of the link here provided in the slide. And here, looking at example of indigenous people contribution to mitigation and the shifting cultivation that we practice. The women are the one taking care and taking part as a primary worker in the shifting cultivation in the farming system. And these shifting cultivation practice, when they do cultivation, they left the higher tree grown as it is. You can see in the photo, this kind of practice are part of a mitigation practice of climate change. We can look at as an example. Another thing is this is the one in Myanmar. This is the types of vegetable, fruits, and leaf that women have to use while they are delivering their children. So you can see how much biodiversity rich is needed for a woman when they give birth. This kind of leaf are boiled and they make a kind of soup, something to drink for a woman health while delivering the baby. So there is a strong connection between biodiversity and indigenous knowledge, and the women play a role in that as well. However, we face barrier because although we are custodian of land, territory, and natural resources, food producer, guardian of native seed, holder of indigenous knowledge, we are actually the key alliance for the biodiversity conservation and climate change. However, there is a loss of biodiversity nowadays, and climate change, they have impact on us and make us more vulnerable. And we have limited access, space, and representation in governance structure and mechanism at different level. Especially, I engage a lot in climate change, and I realize where climate crisis issue and impact are discussed and decisions are made, our voices are very limited. And we are still invisible, and our rights are not recognized and protected. Our voices and concerns sometimes is even often excluded and left behind. So what we need is that our role and our rights should be recognized and supported, and we should be part of the decision making. Sometimes people trying to highlight on the participation. Not only participation, we need to be part of decision making, because we are the one who can contribute a lot to those actions. And another barrier what we need is also, our problem is that insecure land right and food insecurity. So when our rights are recognized, we can do a lot more. The thing is that also, and we provide with improved right and rule, we can improve our family diet, generate surplus for the market, take advantage of wild biodiversity for medicinal and cultural practice, and enjoy the land from our own worldview. Means that that's the thing we want, more secure of our right and more secure of our land right. And at the moment, our low representation and voices limit the possibility. And without us, they will still have gap in combating the global climate crisis, biodiversity conservation, and there is a need of more elimination, gender inequality, and discrimination against indigenous people. This is the final one, recommendation. We would like to recommend and encourage and request every participant here to be part of promotion of indigenous women role and contribution, should be widely recognized and promote with free, prior, and informed consent, in line with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The way we want, how to be recognized, and then to all encourage and promote more of meaningful representation and participation of indigenous women in action related to climate change and biodiversity conservation. And there is a need to strengthen and support advocacy and lobbying for indigenous women rights, including right of indigenous person with disability at national, regional, and global level, so that we can become visible and our voices are heard. And I agree with the first speaker, already talked about a lot on research and documentation on Indigenous women as repository of traditional knowledge and using them as evidence-based documentation towards policy reform for Indigenous women and more to promote more of women leadership at all levels. And thank you very much. And I also include two more links. The first one is Strong Roots, which is published by IWGIA. And there is more of a case study of Indigenous women engagement in climate action in Myanmar. And the other one is AIPP. They have an Indigenous Women program. You can learn more from these two link of information as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, E, for your presentation from a regional perspective from Asia. I think you touch upon some of the issues that it has been also presented before, but contextualized in Asia, although there are a lot of commonalities as we have seen, I think, but the crucial role of Indigenous women in preserving Indigenous knowledge, preserving, disseminating, and strengthening Indigenous people's knowledge. I think the importance of considering Indigenous peoples, and particularly Indigenous women in that context, as a key ally in the preservation of biodiversity and in the struggle or the fighting against climate change, I think is also very important to highlight. And of course, the issue of recognition of rights, that they are directly interrelated. Without the recognition and the protection of Indigenous rights, very little can be achieved. I think, of course, in the context of the recognition and the protection of Indigenous people's rights, the need of ensure the elimination of any kind of discrimination, both towards Indigenous peoples, but particularly also Indigenous women who suffer that the most. And thanks a lot for sharing your recommendations, which I think is a very concrete contribution to the upcoming session of the Commission on the Status of Women, which I assume that EAPP have submitted or will submit to the Commission for the consideration. So thank you very much, EE.
Lola, you're on mute.
Sorry. No, I assume that we will show a video presentation from Molly.
Yes.
So can you show the video, Isa?
Of course, thank you very much.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Brothers that are here with us today. We are sharing our own experiences in Uganda. It is the truth that climate change crisis and COVID-19 are the things that are really affecting women negatively, and yet we already have that issues of inequality. Why? Because the majority of women and girls are poor, they lack access to information, and they're also dependent on the natural environment, which is slowly suffering from degradation. So Indigenous women and girls, they have suffered most during COVID-19 lockdown with household stress. Around that same time, desert locusts also invaded our community, destroyed crops, laid their eggs in the soil, and right now the soil texture has been affected negatively. So that there is low crop yields, leading to the challenges of low productivity that is being experienced by Indigenous women and youth, especially girls. Indigenous women and girls in our local community have been practicing climate smart agriculture as a strategy to reduce the challenges of climate change crisis. In this case, we are using organic fertilizers that are made from mixture of cow dung and red pepper solutions to destroy rodents. We also use neem leaf solutions as natural pesticides to use in destroying the pests and diseases that affects crops mostly. We are planting indigenous tree seedlings alongside crops to combat pests from destroying the crops, while other indigenous tree seedlings with healing properties are acting as pollinators. Let's see some of the examples of those indigenous trees that are really helping us to mitigate and adapt to climate change. We have olive tree, which hosts trainers of crops. We have ogale tree that are hosting fireworms from destroying the crops. So these indigenous tree species are known for reducing the rate of pest attack on plants, as well as providing windbreak, therefore mitigating climate change. Example 2, we have moringa tree, we have mbuvule tree, we have malaina tree, odugu tree, which provide shelter and habitat to pollinators. The planting of these indigenous trees helps to mitigate against climate change by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the use of these organic fertilizers enables farmers to harvest clean crops that are needed for human consumption as well as plant intake, unlike the use of other chemicals that are not proving so good to our human health. Other climate-smart agricultural practices such as basin farming, Furrow-dike irrigation helps maintain soil texture and its fertility by retaining high water content in the soil during dry season, as well as maintaining good amount of water in the soil during rainy season, therefore increasing the soil fertility, increasing high crop productivity without disturbing the ecosystem. Indigenous tree species such as shea trees or dugu trees have large leaves that help in rainfall formation, and rain is needed for boosting the growth of our plants. A number of women and youth in big cities and town centers have also embraced kitchen gardening, where vegetables and food spices are grown and harvested for home use, as well as then organic fertilizers are added to the crops, are yielding very clean and healthy vegetables, food spices, and herbs that are needed in boosting body immunity. The practices are climate smart because organic fertilizers are friendly to both plants and humans, and moreover, the practice also ensures that the ecosystem is well preserved, therefore mitigating climate change. Indigenous people in our community are adapting to new innovation of preserving indigenous tree species by cutting those trees halfway and allowing the tree stems to grow again and develop into strong roots, strong stem, and fresh leaves that will be preserved for consumption by the future generation. Researchers have found out that budding destroys the originality of the tree form, so the indigenous tree stamping is preferred as it's useful in preserving trees that will act as windbreakers, therefore mitigating climate change. We also have another strategy of mitigating and adapting to climate change by indigenous women through promoting the skills of local artisans and craftsmen in the manufacture and consumption of locally made hats, the mats, the baskets, the kitchenwares and appliances, the beds, the chairs that are made from papyrus instead of consuming exotic ones that are made from wood, straws, plastics, whose production and consumption has proven to be very dangerous to the environment. So these local products easily decompose into soil manure, therefore adding value to the soil texture. Moreover, these are innovations that are valuable income-generating activities which are climate smart. Thank you so much for your audience. Otherwise, these are the strategies that we are using in our community to cope up with COVID-19, the challenges of inequality in our community, and the issues of climate change crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Molly. And it was good that we could show your presentation in a video. I think it's very important, your presentation about the practices that you have used to combat climate change by practicing a smart and sustainable agriculture, planting indigenous trees, using organic fertilizers, and also the use of products, of local products, and the development of agricultural artifacts. I think the whole issue of innovation, seeing also the context of indigenous knowledge and indigenous practices as a part of the innovation, I think is a very important contribution from indigenous women and in the situation on how to combat climate change. So thank you very much, Molly, for sharing it with us today. And now I will give the floor to Victoria Tauli Corpus. I don't think Victoria, Vicky, needs also a lot of introduction. Is an indigenous leader from the Cancanay Igorot people of the Cordillera region in the Philippines. And she has devoted her life for the promotion of indigenous people's rights. She has worked over 3 decades on building movements about indigenous peoples in Asia, globally, and also with regard to indigenous women's rights. Of course, she was a member of the UN Permanent Forum and the chair for quite many years. And after that, she was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 2014 to April 2020. So welcome, Vicky. It's an honor for us to have you with us today. And I don't know if you could respond to some issues raised by the speakers. You also have a very, very important report made during your mandate about indigenous women, which includes a huge amount of recommendations in many ways that continue to be very relevant, because I suppose that most of them are not being implemented. How to continue using your report, your recommendations in the context also now the Commission on the Status of Women. Please, Vicky, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Lola, and thank you to all the presenters. We have learned a lot. I have learned a lot from what you have contributed, especially in terms of defining the distinct impacts of climate change on indigenous peoples in general, but on indigenous women as well. I think your statements, your presentations in terms of what indigenous women are doing to contribute in strengthening the resilience of their communities, as well as their capacity to mitigate climate change, these are important information that really has to reach the ears of the decision makers, and these contributions actually are provide even the stronger argument for ensuring that indigenous women are able to participate in, not just participate in political spaces, but also, of course, to be a decision in the decision making processes. I think what I have heard is that women occupying these spaces, both from the local up to the global level, has made big differences, in terms of the contributions that they have done, especially stressing the role of women as the main food providers, water providers, the ones who are transferring knowledge intergenerationally, the knowledge and the cultural values that are very important to ensure that the ecosystem remains more viable, as the land and the territories are the key means of survival for indigenous peoples all over the world. And the impacts of climate change that destroy some of these territories, like the melting of the ice sheets, of course, droughts that are lingering in many places, as well as floods, causing a lot of erosion. These are creating even more problems for indigenous women, because when they are being displaced, or their communities are being subjected to those disasters, they are still the ones who take care of the most vulnerable in the disaster areas. They're the ones who take care of the sick, the old people as well as the children. So their burdens are multi-layered, but still, so the support that they need is really crucial, no? And this support will come in the form of course, resources for them to be able to undertake the roles that they have that they are playing, but also the political spaces wherein they can contribute in shaping the climate change local action plans, no, and of course the national action plans. There really is a need to take a look at the climate change programs and plans of the countries to see how they are able to integrate, of course, indigenous people's concerns in general, but in particular, how they have considered the need to provide support for indigenous women who are doing the most significant actions towards that will ensure better resilience of communities after the climate change impacts. I think the rest of the points that were raised in terms of indigenous women being incentivized and being, providing more possibilities for them to share their knowledge and their practices is really important. No, the world is now in a situation where people are at a loss on what they need to do. And the example, for instance, cited by Molly in Uganda, where organic agriculture, climate smart agriculture means using organic fertilizers, taking care of pollinators, ensuring that water resources are made available so that when there are droughts, they will not be suffering in the worst ways we can imagine. These kinds of examples are examples that are being done by women, indigenous women in many parts of the world. No, we also heard what EE has mentioned in terms of what the ACCA, for instance, are doing. So I think that, these kinds of contributions should really be fed into the body that was established by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the local communities and indigenous people's platform for sharing of traditional knowledge. We should be able to document, these in various forms, whether in video or in written reports, so that we will be able to populate, the website of our of that particular mechanism. The fact that the UN Climate Change Convention has agreed to set up a mechanism within its own formal structures that allow for indigenous traditional knowledge holders to participate is already a big success. No, this means that they are now slowly recognizing indigenous knowledge. And in the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there are lots of references to the important contributions of indigenous knowledge, to climate change adaptation and mitigation. So I think that this growing recognition is something that we should capitalize on. So, and to ensure that there are really indigenous women are actively members. They are also equally, the gender equality in the membership of these various bodies is ensured, at least in the local communities and indigenous people's platform. They try as best as they can to have half of the experts as women and the others are men, half are men. No, so that's a good development. Of course, in the other bodies, the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples and the permanent forum, we also ensure that the gender equality is practice, in the selection of people to occupy those spaces that we ourselves have helped establish. I think one of the issues I want to raise is in the Commission on the Status of Women, some of the rapporteurs, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and the Working Group on Violence Against Women, which are special procedures in the Human Rights Council, they are not given that much space in the Commission on the Status of Women. And yet I think these are procedures, these are processes that will really elaborate further what the situation of Indigenous women are and what their participation will bring into the discussions of the Commission on the Status of Women. So I think one of my strong recommendations in the Commission on the Status of Women further beef up the participation of Indigenous women. I know that this process we are doing now is related to the sessions of the Commission, and hopefully there will be more of these kinds of events that will take place in the sessions of the Commission on the Status of Women, and we are looking forward also to the finalization of the recommendation of the general recommendation of the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. They are making now a general recommendation on Indigenous women, and we would like to look forward to having this come out finally, and that we will be able to use this. So as we are as part of our effort to celebrate International Women's Day, and of course the session of the Commission on the Status of Women, the results of this workshop, I'm sure, will also be shared with the Commission, and I encourage all of us to be engaged in making more visible these contributions, because only then will we be able to get the dominant society, the bigger world, to listen to us and give us the support that we need for us to be able to sustain the contributions, the important contributions that we have already shown, but which we will even make further. And finally, I think that the point about innovations is also important. The innovations that are being developed by the women, whether this is in terms of breeding seeds that can withstand floods or droughts, in ensuring that the indigenous tree species that are capturing carbon will remain, and that they will be multiplied in much more, in a bigger way. And of course, the innovations that they are making in terms of technologies that will ensure food security and water sustainability are key. So we should look into these various innovations that women have been doing, as well as the monitoring observations, the observations that they are doing on a daily basis on the changes that are happening in their lands and in their waters. So in summary, I think that what I can say is that from the contributions of our speakers, we have seen very concrete examples of how women are addressing climate change, and they have also cited recommendations that should be going into the bodies, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as the Commission on the Status of Women and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Fortunately, we do see a stronger participation of Indigenous women, because in the Indigenous caucuses, we ensure that there are also equal number of women participating. And we hope that this trend continues, and that the invisibility of women will really be addressed in the most profound ways. Thank you very much, Lola, and good evening. It's nighttime in my place, so it's good evening to everybody.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And yeah, you touch upon so many things. But I will also mention here, because I think one issue that I think is very important that you mentioned is that the Commission on the Status of Women invite the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Indigenous Women and the working group. And I think it's very important, and I think it's we need to strategize on how to use it. But as you may know, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women is preparing this year a report on violence against Indigenous women.
Right, yeah.
The need also to ensure the link, the work of the Commission on the Status of Women to the rights
yeah,
of
exactly.
women and the rights of Indigenous women.
People.
Of course, Tarsila mentioned the general recommendations of the CEDAW on Indigenous women, which will be public or will be presented soon. And we have the report of the Special Rapporteur, I think, somehow how to to integrate, to present, to make much more advocacy about those issues in the context of the Commission, on the status of the Commission of Women, very important. I think the other issues, Vicky, you have already said it so well, and also with the recap of some of the key issues presented by the previous speakers. So thank you very much, Vicky.
Okay.
So with Vicky's presentation, we go ahead with the last part of the event, which focus on from words to actions, commitments and plans with Indigenous women. And I think it's important because in that context, I think it's very important to see how things are not kept at the international or the global level and the voices are there, but somehow they have an impact on the realities on the ground. And we are very pleased to have with us Jen Rubis from the Green Climate Fund. And Jen Rubis is a Dayak from Sarawak on Malaysian Borneo with over 20 years of advocacy on Indigenous peoples' issues. She's in the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat for the Green Climate Fund. And previously, she has worked in UNESCO's Local and Indigenous Knowledge Systems program from 2009 to 2019, focusing on Indigenous knowledge of climate change and biodiversity. Please, Jen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Lola. I have a presentation. Let me see if I can share the screen. Can you give me a thumbs up, Lola, if you can see the presentation?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Perfect, perfect. Okay. First of all, I'd just like to start by saying thank you very much to the organizers, to FIMI, to IWGIA, and to AIPP for inviting me to speak at this event. I was asked to give some brief words on support for Indigenous women's commitments and plans. And I would like to do it by sharing some information about the GCF Indigenous Peoples Policy, because I think here at the Fund, it could provide a very unique framework for this. And I hope you'll be able to see what I mean when I go through the presentation. Let's see, click. Okay, very quickly, what's the Green Climate Fund? It's a critical element. It's an outcome of the Paris Agreement. It's the world's largest climate fund, has over 190 projects, has dispersed about 10 billion with about 6.9 being implemented. And its mandate is to support developing countries to raise and realize their NDC ambitions, their nationally determined contributions to climate change. Within this sort of, within the GCF, we've got something called a ESMS, that's an environmental and social management system. And this basically provides the space by which GCF can also incorporate environmental and social considerations in addition to its climate goals. So it means more than just safeguard measures or do no harm, which is certainly very important. We also want to improve environmental and social outcomes, generate co-benefits to the environment, communities, Indigenous peoples. So for example, we've got the environmental and social policy that includes a has a revision since 2021 to include a policy on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. We've got a gender policy that was updated in 2019, and we've got an Indigenous peoples policy since 2018. Just very quick introduction to the gender policy, because it's also an important policy for us. It seeks to place, through a gender approach, put women at the center of finding solutions. It promotes climate investments that are that advance gender equality through adaptation and mitigation, provides climate investments, again, this do no harm, minimize risk, including to gender-related risk and climate-related risk. It has a commitment to reduce the gender gap through climate investments that will mainstream gender equality. And one of the main instruments of this is ensuring that all funding proposals have a gender assessment and a gender action plan. So here's already one avenue where we make sure that there are actions for women included in all the climate change projects. Then I want to go into a little bit on the Indigenous peoples policy. again, it's another thing that provides us a structure, and it provides us a structure for ensuring that activities of the GCF are developed, implemented in a way that promotes the full respect, promotion, safeguarding of Indigenous peoples. We want this policy to ensure that IPs can benefit from GCF activities and projects in a culturally appropriate manner, and also do not suffer harm or adverse effects from the design and implementation of the finance activities. The IP policy is applied to all financed activities, both from the public sector and private sector, because GCF works on private sector and public sector. It has a broad criteria, including in its as Indigenous peoples, groups that might not be nationally recognized, so with this broad scope of application, we want to ensure that we're recognizing the huge diversity of Indigenous peoples from across the regions where GCF funds activities. What does the policy contain? It contains a couple of things, but it contains, first of all, a set of project requirements to ensure that communities have been fully informed, they've been consulted, and provided opportunities to participate in the project. It includes ensuring that pre-informed and informed consent has been applied in certain circumstances, but it also identifies opportunities for enhancing Indigenous people's participation in the GCF. And I think this is where we want to work on a little bit more. So I just want to point out a few places in the policy that really try and push this notion of access for Indigenous peoples. It's in the objectives of the policy that to recognize and operationalize Indigenous peoples' equitable access to the benefits of GCF funded activities. It's a guiding principle of the facility of the policy to facilitate access to GCF resources for Indigenous peoples. We will encourage the national designated authorities and accredited entities to engage with and be inclusive in Indigenous peoples. We may also consider taking actions to better meet the needs and priorities of Indigenous peoples to support initiatives and efforts for climate change mitigation and adaptation actions. Finally, and there's also this very interesting section in the policy, which could really be sort of analyzed very well. There's two little paragraphs that says that GCF will give consideration to activities proposed for GCF financing that are tailored to meet the needs and priorities of Indigenous peoples and to support their initiatives and efforts for climate change mitigation and action. So here, you have that window already to have activities of Indigenous people supported. It also says that GCF may target funds to support Indigenous people's climate change adaptation and mitigation initiatives if it is necessary to correct for climate change exacerbated Indigenous people's equality, or if they're not benefiting from GCF support adequately. So there's this notion that that funds could actually be actively targeted. As a portfolio grows, these sort of avenues may increasingly provide opportunities to really enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples. But what is the current framework by which funding is delivered? We deliver it through partnership approach. So just GCF doesn't give out funds directly. We have 113 accredited entities that partner with GCF who actually do the implementation of the projects. This range of accredited entities includes banks, multilateral, national, international finance institutions, development institutions, UN agencies, conservation organizations, equity funds, government agencies, regional institutions, etc. Under the Paris Agreement, the GCF is mandated to provide climate finance to developing countries. So there are also national designated authorities, so representatives from the government that represent 147 countries across the region. So these are the two main partners who can mobilize the finance to implement projects relevant for Indigenous peoples. As noticed in the previous slides, our partners have to ensure that they do take the IP policy into account when they develop proposals, as well as when they implement them. So you've got on the slide, I've showed you two key ways. One is developing an actual project. So there's project implementation. And here you have AEs being advised through the policy that they can include technical or financial support as part of their activities to strengthen participation of Indigenous peoples in the climate change actions. So this is quite broad, and the policy says, for example, to recognize customary land tenure, to address gender, social, intergenerational issues, protect traditional knowledge, strengthen capacity, strengthen government capacity to provide services to IPs, etc. And then you also, in addition to projects, there's also readiness and preparatory projects, readiness and preparatory support to develop the projects. But this is also another interesting support path of funds. So NDAs, the national designated authorities and accredited entities, can also use these programs to support initiatives to promote climate resiliency of Indigenous peoples. So when they want to prepare profiles on Indigenous peoples, to document culture, to facilitate partnerships, they can also use this program called the Readiness Program to try and build this sort of relationship. So that's another window. Oops. So I just wanted to flash quickly two examples of projects that have been approved or by the board and been implemented that have involved Indigenous peoples. Both of them come from the Latin America region. The first one is a project approved in 2020 at the 27th meeting of the board on resilient livelihoods of vulnerable smallholder farmers in Mayan landscapes and in the dry corridor of Guatemala. It's FAO that's implementing this project, but I don't think it started implementation yet, although it has been approved, but then there's this legal process to develop the agreements. Second is an example of what I just said was a readiness activity. So here you have something also implemented by FAO. They worked with FILAC and the government of Nicaragua to establish a regional dialogue of Indigenous peoples, Latin America and the Caribbean, inviting NDAs from Latin America to dialogue with Indigenous leaders. So here's another example of how funds can be targeted for dialogue and partnership building. So I'm going to end. This is my final slide with something that is, I think, going to be an increasingly very important channel by which we can realize some of the aspects of enhancing participation in financing. And this is the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group. It is established to enhance coordination between GCF, the accredited entities, executing entities, between states and Indigenous peoples, to provide advice, to review implementation and monitoring of the policy, and to provide guidance as may be requested. So I'm going to, the members for 2022 to 2024 are Kimaran from Kenya, Tunga from Nepal, Juan Carlos from Ecuador, and including alternates Balkisu from Cameroon, Helen from Philippines, and Viviana from Argentina. I'm sure many of you who are in the movement will recognize these names very well, and we're very pleased and very proud to have them as part of our advisory group. And just in closing, I would like to also say that this advisory group could really not have been here without people like Vicky supporting and really putting a lot of intention to mobilizing Indigenous peoples on climate finance. And we really could not be here without the work of her network and her support. So I hope this information has been very useful. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jen, for giving that very substantive information about the Green Climate Fund, the gender policy, which of course in the context what we are discussing now, it's very important, and it's very important to see the linkages also with the Indigenous people's policy. And of course, Indigenous people's policy of the Green Climate Fund has been prized by many Indigenous peoples also, and the, of course, the establishment of the advisory group that is the result of many years of advocacy of Indigenous peoples in the context of the work on climate change, climate financing, and of course the Green Climate Funds. Thank you very much, Jen, which is very complementary to all what we have discussed, because at the very end, many of the speakers also have mentioned the need of resources. I mean, the need for Indigenous peoples to be able to confront, or Indigenous women also particularly, to confront the challenges they face with climate change, but also with regard to their contribution, their innovation, the mitigation measures that they can implement based on their Indigenous knowledge needs to be financed, needs finances to be done. So thank you very much, Jen, for your contribution. And now I think we will open the floor for questions. We will have a round of questions, and I will ask Isabel if she could help me with the questions. I will.
Yes.
Yes, Isabel, go ahead.
We have comments in the chat, ¿no? Saludos de la hermana Sandra Ubok, de Guatemala. Ella es Maya, y manda saludos y menciona sobre el cambio climático. Es importante, pero también es un desafío, porque nosotros estamos tratando de contribuir en el cuidado de la madre tierra, pero hay grandes empresas, nos atacan también, arriesgamos nuestras vidas y muchos están encarcelados o encarceladas. Esperamos la unidad del mundo. También la vivienda ecológica es otra forma de contribuir al cambio climático. Gracias, hermana.
Gracias. Gracias, Isabel.
No tenemos más preguntas en este momento.
I would like to know if somebody from the audience is interested in raising a question to any of the speakers. And if you do, please introduce yourself or raise your hand. Use the feature in the Zoom of raising your hand and introduce yourself and specify to whom you want to address your question.
We have Chanda Tapa.
Yes.
Please, Chanda, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Good morning and good evening. I'm Chanda Thapa Magar, speaking from Kathmandu right now. And I'm currently working with International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. And so good to see you all here. And thank you to all the panelists for this amazing presentation. So my question was, I think Jan also mentioned, and then Vicky also, about, sorry, my video, there is something wrong with the video, so I can't turn on the video. I think there is increasing participation of, maybe not as significant as we actually want, but there is some increasing participation of Indigenous women at the global climate change processes. But my question is more about, like, I mean, Jan mentioned about Indigenous women are the core, I mean, at the center of like climate solution. So that everyone agrees on that. But in terms of accessing to the resources, particularly the funding on whether it's like climate funding or kind of climate financing or CVD related, or even like gender equality fund, we are still skeptic about like whether those resources, those funding will be reaching to those Indigenous women, Indigenous women's organizations. So this can be to Vicky and also to Jan, like what can be our accountability mechanisms that we can think of to make those funders or like philanthropic communities accountable to ensure the funding to the Indigenous women on the ground. Yeah, I'll just stop here.
Thank you, Chanda. I don't know if Jen or Vicky want to respond.
I can respond briefly to that. To that 2 points that were raised. First, the point about, of course, the indigenous peoples being subjected also to the worst forms of human rights violations, and that's really true. No, if you recall, the Global Witness report that emerged of 2021 shows that there are 290 environmental defenders, human rights defenders who have been killed, and 30% of these are indigenous peoples. No, they are indigenous individuals who have been killed. And of course, the countries which featured as the ones who have the highest numbers are Colombia, Mexico, and the Philippines. No, so that's the reality that we have to deal with, and that's precisely why we need to be active in all the various mechanisms where we can bring these reports of people being subjected to human rights violations, because they are doing their role in protecting their territories from climate, from projects that destroy the environment and their territories. No, the second question is about the funds. Yes, we have created a green climate fund tracker, and you can go to our website and see that. And this is meant to track the projects that are being funded by the Green Climate Fund, and which of these funds have really provided support to indigenous peoples or have engaged indigenous peoples in the projects that are now going to receive the funds. No, so that's one way of monitoring, but we are encouraging everybody to monitor. In fact, we are going to do a research very soon on climate finance to see how indigenous peoples have really benefited from this climate finance that is seen not just from the green climate funds but from other sources of funds as well. No, and the other thing is as you know, there is this Pawanka Fund, no, which is the president is Mirna Cunningham, and this Pawanka Fund has climate change as one of its recurring theme, and this has supported indigenous peoples who are wanting to implement and strengthen the resilience as well as strengthen their mitigation and adaptation processes. And if you go to the Pawanka website, you will see that many of these projects have really brought very concrete results, no, for the communities. For instance, in Kenya, among the mga pastoralists, they have created a water pond, which is constantly fed with water, and this helps whenever there are droughts, no, and that happen in that particular area. But of course, the processes that are entailed in terms of accessing, especially the green climate funds, are very tedious. No, even TIBA, which is quite sophisticated in the way we manage funds, we refuse to apply to be accredited because we cannot meet the demands of accreditation. It takes a long time to have ourselves accredited. So we have to work with the designated authorities and the accredited entities. No, so that's something that we as indigenous people should beef our capacities to be able to absorb, the funds that will be coming from the Green Climate Fund, because these are huge amounts of money. No, and finally, your question about accountability. That's why we have to have this way of monitoring climate finance, because we have to see, like many of the intermediary organizations getting funds, how much of these funds are really going to indigenous territories. And that kind of report has to come out also regularly, so that we'll be able to expose, which are the good practices, as well as address those those groups, those organizations which get big parts of the fund and crumbs only go into the indigenous territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. Jen, would you want to respond, to say anything?
Yes, just very quickly, because Vicky actually really covered the key thing I wanted to say, which is that I think one of the ways that, for example, under the gender policy, they have, like I said, a gender assessment and gender action plan. In the gender action plan, there's budget. So there's a way to track gender participation of women and how much flows down in terms of women's issues. What we're kind of missing is this Indigenous women. We're not disaggregating the data enough. So it's efforts like what Tebteba is doing this IP tracker, but also, yeah, trying to just get more data and monitoring so that we know how much actually is flowing down to the ground. Because I completely agree. I suspect that not as much is going to the ground as we would like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. So now I will give the floor to Suomi Astray. Please, Suomi, introduce yourself, identify to whom do you target your question. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, good morning. I'm Somi from Jharkhand, Ashray, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here. I went through GFC and I was eager to know because we have implemented a 5-year project. As Chanda said, we have implemented a 5-year project in Jharkhand for the tribal community. We have worked with the indigenous technical knowledge systems, and we have worked on climate change, which has been approved by the university. But as rightly said by Chanda in the previous question, funds is a very big problem. We have approvals, and I just see that GFC also has an accreditation partner, NABARD, which is with whom we have already worked with Innovations Fund as well for climate change. So I just wanted how we can think on a scale up of the already implemented project through and what could be the way via NABARD or through GFC.
Should I just take this directly, Lola? Or
yes, please go take it directly.
Okay, thanks, Swami, for your question. I think this is a very relevant question, an important one for people to know. If you have good relationships with an accredited entity to the GCF, by all means, I think you should really try and approach them because they know, they know much more better than me how to access GCF funding. So I think it takes a conversation with them. I think perhaps you could go and look at a policy and say, look, but it would be also great because we could, we could demonstrate and be a pilot for all of these great actions on the ground. But yes, by all means, have a conversation with your AE and as well with your NDA if you happen to have relationships with them as well. Over.
Ma'am, I'm trying to share the project upload. I just want to upload it. If you can just see it, because it was a very impactful project and we were very sad when that project ended. So if that could be taken as a scale up, it could do, because Jharkhand is drought prone and most of the funds go to Rajasthan and other dry lands. But our women face a lot of problem and migration is preponderant due to this, especially for indigenous women. So this is important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Swami. I have one last question in the chat that I would like to share with the speakers, and I don't know if any of you could comment and try to respond. I think in the chat we see that, good morning, I'm Fiorella Triscriti. I work at the UN with the Department of Political Affairs. My question is about Indigenous peoples and climate security. I think that there is increasing work bringing visibility to the positive impact of Indigenous peoples to address the climate crisis, but limited work that then looks at how these efforts also address human security. Any comments on this? Hi, Fiorella, do you want to add something?
Yes, maybe I can just say a few words. Well, indeed, human security, of course, is very much related to climate change, and and as we have mentioned earlier, food insecurity, the arrests of environmental rights defenders, as well as conflicts between communities are also happening. No, with the shortage of, with the drying up of aquifers, I know of situations where there are water conflicts between communities because they don't have access, the easy access that they used to have over water. No, and I think that's an issue that has not been really addressed very well, even within the climate change context. No, and I'm hoping that in the subsequent reports from the human rights mechanisms or procedures like the special rapporteurs, they will be able to highlight this. No, in fact, there are reports which say that in some countries, the conflicts that happen have really happened because of the impacts of climate change. No, and I think that is something that we are seeing very much. And of course, now, I mean, I would just like to mention, we cannot end our session without talking about a little bit about Ukraine. No, the situation in Ukraine is really something that also shows the kind of insecurity that's there. And Russia, which is a major oil producer, which just invaded Ukraine. The indigenous peoples in Ukraine are very much affected, no, by this kind of invasion, and that kind of insecurity is something that that we have to speak up against. No, this kind of conflict, that kind of invasion cannot really be ignored. And I'm encouraging indigenous women, especially because the women are the ones again bearing the bigger burden, to speak up and to sign on to petitions that are calling for a stop to this war. But yes, human security is very much directly linked to climate change, and much more work needs to be done to look at the connections and to address, these problems that have emerged because of the impacts of climate change.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And we have 5 minutes left. Unfortunately, we were not able to get we wanted a state representative to join us today, but we were not able to get any. They are very busy with the preparations for the commission and all this. It was quite difficult to get. So we have 5 minutes left, which I would use if any of the speakers they want to add something or make some remarks on what they said, or something that they didn't brought in the speeches. So any of you of the speakers that we have today, you are very welcome to add or to comment if you have anything before I close the meeting. Jen, do you have your hand up?
Yes, sorry. No, just very quickly. Thanks very much, Lola. I don't want to take more time, but just responding to Fiolera's question, one of maybe looking at it from another lens, we're constantly asked as well when we review the funding proposals that go before the GCF board to look at conflict analyses. Yeah. So that's also one aspect where you can look at this intersection between communities, conflicts between communities that could occur or could be prevented as a result of GCF funding, and if it could, what are the actions that we need to put into place to mitigate them? So that's one area where you can say that there's some kind of interaction between climate and human security issues. But other than that, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, and again, once again, to the organizers, thanks for participation, inviting me to participate in this panel. Over.
Thank you very much, Jen. And I don't know if any of the speakers want to say something. Please go ahead, or raise your hand, or just go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add on. When thinking about Indigenous women role, taking care of the family and the natural environment, nowadays there is also increased threat for Indigenous women as an environment defender. they are part of it, no? Together with other indigenous community leader, and we should also take care of this issue that more women, indigenous women who are taking part of protection of the environment are also facing threats, and we need to help support them in all possible way as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iyi, for bringing that important issue. We have one hand raised from Luz Alba Trujillo. Please go ahead.
Gracias, muy buenos días para todas y todos. Les doy las gracias por la invitación y está muy importante este taller que empezó para nosotros acá en Colombia y en otra oportunidad, a ver si me dan la oportunidad de poder participar. Y nosotros acá estamos trabajando con soberanía alimentaria sobre el cambio climático. Muchas gracias, les agradezco y buen día para todas y todos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Luz. So I think we can close our meeting, but before we close, I want first of all to express our deep gratitude to all the speakers, which I think they have really made some very, very important interventions and presentations here, and of course to all participants, but also to remind what I said in the beginning, that this event is organized in the margins of the Commission on the Status of Women, which will start on Monday, and the need to really increase visibility within the work of the Commission on Indigenous Women issues. As I said, Indigenous women's voices need to be heard, but not only heard, they should be included, incorporated, their recommendations in the decision-making that the Commission take. And I know Indigenous women, and particularly in that context, FIMI has been leading the participation of Indigenous women in the Commission on the Status of Women, and really the last year increasing raise their visibility there. But much more work needs to be done, and much more work to link with other processes also. That I think one of the things that Indigenous peoples have been incredibly wise to do is these linkages between global processes. Don't see them in silos, but whatever achievement is in one process, so use it to push for in the other process. And this is an issue also that Indigenous women do in the context of the Commission of the Status of Women. So with this, I would like to say again, thanks to all of you, and thanks also to our interpreters and of course my co-organizers of the event. Thank you very much.